Our last study had to do with the period called the period of the Judges. And a couple of those judges, Shamgar, little known, and Samson, much better known, were judges that God raised up to deal with the aggressive body of people in the southwest corner of Palestine along the Mediterranean coast, known as the Philistines. And that leads us right into our study for today, and that is called the Philistine Menace, study number 12 in the Old Testament. After the time of the Judges, at least after the time of Samson, time went by, and the Philistines that we knew under Samson's time began to grow in number and in expertise and in determination, and became a substantial threat to the very existence, actually, of Israel in the land of Palestine. So we're talking now in this study about a military force that is far beyond what Samson encountered, or Shamgar for that matter of fact, in the earlier period. And so the artist portrays on this picture that particular fact by showing this large, massive army, all standing in array, and this, of course, is the Mediterranean. And you'll notice that there are ships on the sea. They were known as sea people, but they are predominantly determined to become a major player in the Palestinian stronghold. They wanted to do business in a stronger way than ever before. And so this massive army indicates Israel now is threatened big time by a major power called Philistia. What I want to do now is have you take your study sheet that I've made available to you, and under item number 1, where we talk about Philistia now as a major military force with which Israel has to do, to simply walk through the bullet pieces of information that I have put on this paper just to review and to add to your understanding in terms of what the Philistine Menace really is about. So walk with me and follow on your papers, and we'll take these little bullet statements and add that to our base of understanding about what Philistia is about. A, they are a people that were uprooted from Southwest Asia Minor. History tells us that there was something that brought a number of the people that were living in Southwest Asia Minor and uprooted them and sent them on their way. And Philistia, that group of people known as the Philistines, was a part of that. They migrated to Egypt, but they were repulsed, and they moved up to the Mediterranean to settle in southwestern Palestine. They were known as the Sea People, and that's what those boats are about on your teaching picture. Actually, another group of people that were in the much further northern part, actually into the Lebanon area of what we would call Lebanon today, were the Phoenicians, and they were a sea people as well. And so the Philistines are a part of that backdrop and background of people. B, the time of their arrival. Well, it was relatively late. Actually, they settled in Palestine about the same time that Israel began its conquest under Joshua. And so the Israelites, after their conquest under Joshua, lived side by side in relative harmony. The emphasis is on relative, for a number of years. There were intermittent and mounting friction that the Philistines manifest against Israel during the time of the Judges, and we've already alluded to Shamgar and especially Samson. It's interesting about Samson, he is probably the least morally fit of all the judges. And yet he's given the most copy in the Bible of all those 12 judges, or 13, depending how you count. And don't ask me why, but it makes good copy. And obviously, you probably have noticed that your reading for this assignment going into 1 Samuel really is interesting reading. It reads like a novel, but of course it's a historical account of all that's happening in this period. And it probably is easier reading for you than in the time of the Judges, but also the book of Ruth that you read for this particular study. Remember, that book has its setting in the period of the Judges. And it's a reminder that in the midst of all the disgusting things, especially those degrading episodes that are seen in the last chapters of the book of Judges, need to be counterbalanced by the fact that there were people like you read about in the book of Ruth. And so that's a sort of a consoling note to know that there were some people that were, as we would say, salt of the earth, godly type people, even in the time of the Judges. Well, see, they were now back to Philistia. They were an aggressive people. They intermarried with the Canaanites. They adopted their language and their religion. And there's a method to that because, as we will note in item number 2, they aspired to gain control over all of Canaan. And they believed that the best way to do it was to join in, become like one of them, and then begin to make their inroads and to establish themselves in strongholds and to make the conquest bit by bit. So the last item then is they threatened to swallow up Israel bit by bit. And at this particular point, they actually are thwarting the very existence of Israel as a nation in the land of Palestine. So those are some pieces of information that you can pick up from books that deal with the history of who the Philistines were. Now, the next item, as we go back to the teaching picture, has to do with something unique about this particular military force. And you'll notice that this warrior, who's a Philistine warrior, has a metal shield, he has a metal spear, and he has a metal sword and helmet. And if you look carefully, those warriors that are seen in the front ranks are also people who are armed with metal, that's iron in this case, armaments. And so they are people who have the up-to-date equipment, the best and the mostest for this particular era of history. So let's take, again, your study sheet, and under item 2, where we talk about that Philistia was well organized as a military power, and that they are substantially different from the kind of adversary powers, enemies that Israel faced during the period of the Judges. Now we're talking about something that is more advanced. It is more threatening, and it is Philistia ready to do business in Palestine. A, the previous enemies were localized in their threat and limited in their conquest ambitions, but not so the Philistines. B, Philistia was organized around 5 military states. You can find a map, I'm sure, at your leisure if you look into the south western part of Palestine. You will find cities by the name of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath. And these are the 5 Philistine strongholds, city-states. And all of them stand in stark contrast to Israel. Israel is a loose confederacy drawn together and having a unity in the fact that they have allegiance, some faithful and some not so faithful, to their covenant God Jehovah. That's the binding force that draws these 12 tribes together, a loose confederacy still at this point in her history. C, Israel was not only unorganized as a political unit, she also had no standing army. That's in contrast to the Philistines. She relied on Minuteman type of defense. That is to say, when the call to arms was made and the messengers went out, at least to the adjacent tribes of the tribe that was threatened, it was, come and help us. And some did and some didn't, but at least they would then throw their working tools down and take their military tools and rally to the sound, and under a given leader they would go forth to war. And finally, D, Israel, as this particular picture shows, with the iron implements that these military people of Philistia have, Israel is slow on the uptake of iron. Now, I know it talks about plowshares in 1 Samuel, but I'm not sure whether that's a later addition, whether those are metal plowshares, perhaps of some kind of bronze. See, the Bronze Age preceded the Iron Age, but typically historians indicate that iron didn't come to be a viable metal for use in Israel until the time of Saul. And of course that's coming up real quick like, but at any rate, whatever Israel has by way of iron is very, very limited. And so I state here that the first iron-tipped plows date to Saul's reign. Horses and chariots didn't come till Solomon's time. And you'll notice that these people have their horses and chariots already. And more than that, the Philistines controlled the iron works. And so if we think in terms of the desert war of some years back, and we saw the bombs that were dropped, and we saw how smart bombs would find their target. Well, iron would be comparable to what the smart bomb is for us in our time, to what iron was for them in their time. And so Israel was militarily, in technology, in a time lag. They were behind the times. Now, that's brought up in 1 Samuel 13, and I'll read a couple of sentences from there. There were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel in those days. The Philistines wouldn't allow them, for fear they would make swords and spears for the Hebrews. So whenever the Israelites needed to sharpen their plowshares, pickaxes, sickles, they had to take them to a Philistine blacksmith. So none of the people of Israel had a sword or spear except Saul and Jonathan. Well, that's the picture. So you've got a view of Philistia, and you've got a view of Israel in terms of those two contesting bodies of people. And now I want to step away from that for a second and take a look at what is happening on a different front. And on the bottom of sheet number 1, I make a statement that brings us into view with a person by the name of Eli. Eli is a high priest that God raised up during the closing days of the judges. He was in charge of worship and sacrifice in the tabernacle at Shiloh. It was Eli that the Israelites began to look to for guidance and leadership in their spiritual, religious, and civic affairs. Eli knew the Lord. That's especially evident in his earlier years, and we don't know too much about whether that was so much affirmed in his later years, but at any rate, he was a key figure that comes onto the scene here. He is known, of course, because he failed terribly to discipline his sons, his two sons, because of the lineage, were given the role of being priests at the tabernacle, and they were rascals, to say the least. And Eli failed to discipline them. So there you have a particular figure that is portrayed in the first part of the book of Samuel. Now, into that picture, you have a family that comes into view, and we think especially of Hannah. Hannah is a godly woman, and we don't know as much about Elkanah, but he sounds as though he is also a man of God. So God raised up a family that began to play a significant role in the life of Israel. It was the family of Hannah and Elkanah. In answer to prayer, Hannah gave birth to a baby boy named Samuel. He was given to the Lord at birth and brought to Eli. It's amazing at what an early age this young child is brought to Eli. And there he is to be trained, because this young Samuel is vowed by his parents to be a Nazirite. And he's given to the Lord, and he will serve the Lord at the elbow of Eli, where he will be given little errands around the tabernacle and where he will be trained in the things of the Lord. And amazing also is that at a very early age, God begins to send messages to Samuel, that young boy. And here's what we read in the early chapters of the book of Samuel. It raises an interesting question that I want us to discuss for a moment. I'm reading now from the copy. It's from 1 Samuel 3:1. The boy Samuel was serving the Lord by assisting Eli. Now, in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. End of quote. I want you to break now and discuss a question. Why were messages from the Lord very rare in those days? We've just come out of a period where God frequently revealed himself to Moses and to Joshua. And why now this quiescence? And I would suggest that when you break, you might want to find a clue. I think it's a valid clue in the book of Judges, chapter 21, verse 25. Why don't you break now and talk about what we have been going over, and particularly this question. So go to your discussion at this point. I'm interested to know what your discussion yielded in terms of trying to probe the mind of God with regard to why there was such a quiescence during this whole period where God revealed himself so infrequently until little Samuel comes on the scene. But Judges 21:25, as you know, reads, "The people did what was right in their own eyes." Now, that's the attitude that characterizes the period of the Judges, and that's the period when God is not revealing himself. And one Bible commentary put it this way. He said, when people have a sense of their self-willed ways and are not hungry or open to any revelation from God, that's when God ceases to break through in terms of people not receiving a word from the Lord. Another writer said, sin blocked the revelation of God at the spiritual center of the nation. But we know that when we have a hunger for the things of the Lord, and we long to hear his voice, so to speak, that God is faithful to reveal himself. And when that is absent, then we tend to go our own self-willed ways. Now let's go back to our study sheet. And I'm going to read a block now that has to do with the life of Eli as a parent and also as the high priest, as it relates to his responsibility in the guidance and the disciplining of his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And the quotation is from 1 Samuel chapter 2, reading, "Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels who had no respect for the Lord." What a statement. The sins of these young men were very serious in the Lord's sight, for they treated the Lord's offering with contempt. Now, Eli, see, the years have gone long now, and Eli has two sons who are serving as priests, but they're under his guidance. But Eli at this point is very old. He was aware of what his sons were doing to the people of Israel. He knew, for instance, that his sons were seducing the young women who assisted at the entrance of the tabernacle. Eli said, "You must stop, my sons." But Eli's sons wouldn't listen to their father. One day, a prophet came to Eli and gave him a message from the Lord. "Why do you honor your sons more than me? I will put an end to your family, so will no longer serve as my priests." That's a quotation from the New Living Translation in the verses that I enumerate there. Now, that gives us at least a couple of questions to talk over. The first question, what lesson do you draw from this aspect of Eli's life? And if you're using the Bible, the New Living Translation, the Life Application edition of it, you've got a thing called a profile for a number of Bible characters, and there's a profile for Eli, and that profile will help you in responding to that question. The second question is, what is the meaning of the words, "Why do you honor your sons more than me"? These are the Lord's words that are given to a prophet, spoken to Eli. And I refer you to a particular passage there and a note in the study Bible. So take a break and go to your discussion. All right, let's take a look at those two questions briefly before we proceed with our lesson study. First of all, what lesson do you draw from this aspect of Eli's life? Well, the thing that I would like to mention is another question. Did Eli spend so much time and so much of his life and energy in terms of his religious duties and the things pertaining to the tabernacle that his role as a father and as a parent went begging? Did he do these things at the expense of his role as a parent? That's also a spiritual duty, by the way. We don't know exactly how much of the quality of his life was invested in his family. But we do know that he tended to be lax. After God brought this to his attention, he would mention it to his sons, but he really didn't do a whole lot, at least nothing that is recorded. By the way, I should mention that it is very, very possible if people today in the life of the church spend so much time, whether this pertains to the clergy or people on the staff or lay people very much involved in various duties at the church, that if the children in that family, assuming that they're children, young children of the family, grow up and feel that the church is getting more time than they are in terms of the use of your discretionary time, they begin to feel that they're in competition with the church, and they begin to resent the church for that. So we have to watch that we don't fall into what I think is the mistake of Eli's life when his sons were younger and under his parental care and guidance. I think he did a lot better job with Samuel than he did with his own sons. And one writer said, if those two sons that were scoundrels had had a praying mother like Hannah, that is the mother of Samuel, it would have been a different story in their lives. Well, that underscores the tremendously important role of parents. Again, now the last question, what's the meaning of the words, why do you honor your sons more than me? I think these probably pertain to the time when those children are now grown up and take responsibility as priests, as adults. And they are scoundrels. The people know it. Eli knows it. And obviously God knows it. God brings it to Eli's attention and gives him a very stern word about it as to what's going to result. That isn't changed. But nothing seems to happen. And so I think that these words refer to the fact that Eli's lack of putting them out of that office indicates that he honored his sons more than he honored God and the office that represented God to the people. Well, let's continue on and get back to Philistia and Israel, because we've taken the narrative far enough along now. We know that Eli is the high priest. Hophni and Phinehas are those irresponsible priests. And things are not going well between Israel and Philistia. As a matter of fact, things have come to a critical point. And they are drawn in battle lines, one against the other. And the leaders of Israel have the sense that this is the crucial time for their continuance and existence as a nation. If they go down in battle in defeat, as they have in previous occasions against Philistia, this may well be the end of the line. And so they decide that they need to pull out all stops. And so they go to talk to Eli at Shiloh. And they make arrangements with Hophni and Phinehas to take the ark out of the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle and bring it along into the battlefront. And Hophni and Phinehas are those who will carry it. And so that all transpires. And now let's go to the picture. The gloating king and the arrogant commander-in-chief of the army tell you what happened. Here is a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. And you know already from having read the lesson and from your previous study that the Ark was captured, Hophni and Phinehas were slain, and the army was decisively defeated. And so the gloating king is there to portray the fact that they are saying, aha, we have this symbol of their God to add to our panoply of gods, especially our god Dagon. And so that's the story that we've got here. Now turn to your sheet, and on page 3 on the top part, I've got a question about the ark being taken into battle. Now you recall that when Joshua was about to make the great movement into the conquest of Canaan, that the ark was marched around the city of Jericho. The ark was put into play, and they had a massive victory. Now their thinking was, if we take the ark again, that will help us to have victory over the Philistines. Well, it didn't turn out that way at all, and it becomes obvious that it was a mistake. And so the question is, why was it right in one case and wrong in this particular time. And then the follow-up question is, what contemporary application is there to this event? Is there something that we learn from this event in the biblical narrative that has application to our particular day and time now? And I'll be interested to know what you come up with, and obviously I won't hear, but let's take a time to discuss and break now as you go and talk about it. All right, what did you do on those questions? Let me give you a thought, and then we'll move on in our study. The reason why I believe it was wrong for the Israelites to take the ark into battle, and in contradistinction to the time of Jericho, there was no word from the Lord that they should do this, such as in Jericho. And it was to stay in the Holy of Holies. And so it was presumptuous on their part to take it into battle against the counsel that God had normally given, that that's where the ark was to be. He had no time indicated take it into battle. Secondly, it sidestepped the real problem. The reason for the defeat of the Israelites was their lack of loyalty, faithfulness, and obedience to the Lord. It was as simple as that. And they sidestepped that and wanted business as usual and wanted to gain a victory by taking the symbol of God's presence, the ark, into battle. So it was something that camouflaged the real problem. And thirdly, I'd say that they treated the ark like it was some kind of a magic item, that in and of itself, that particular object, that piece of metal, the gold and the chest that held the Ten Commandments, that in and of itself was like a rabbit's foot, so to speak, a magic kind of charm that would help them in battle. You have a note in your study Bible that brings this out, I think, rather well. It reads, this is a note for 1 Samuel 4:3. The Israelites rightly recognized the great holiness of the ark, but they thought that the ark itself, the wood and metal box, was their source of power. They began to use it as a good luck charm, expecting it to protect them from their enemies. A symbol of God does not guarantee his presence and power. Their attitude toward the ark came perilously close to idol worship. All right, what are some contemporary applications of this? By way of a general rule, I think the application is that anytime we take something that is an object or an icon, which is a symbol of something that relates to God, and begin to look at that object or icon as having power in and of itself, and to treat it sort of as a good luck charm, then we have fallen into the same kind of wrongdoing. As a matter of fact, I believe that it's possible to have this happen with the Bible. Now, the Bible is God's Word. God speaks to us through it. And that's the source of its value and its good and its power. Ephesians chapter 6 says that the Word is a sword of the Holy Spirit. So God has said, I will work through my Word. But it is possible for people to have a Bible here and a Bible there in their home, never or seldom opened and read, but they're kind of there as good luck charms or something that is kind of a religious icon. And that's what you would call bibliolatry, thinking that the book in and of itself has got some kind of power without it ever being read prayerfully and expectantly. And by the way, when you do your reading assignments, always begin your reading with a sincere prayer, asking that God would speak to you as you read in this book. It's God's Word made alive by the power of His Spirit. All right, now with that, let's go to the teaching picture once again. Item number 4. And I'm focusing on this individual in the bottom of the picture. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that that Israelite leader is a symbol of a majority of people in Israel who are tremendously impacted by the loss of the ark and this decisive defeat in battle. There's a feeling of hopelessness among many people in Israel that has happened because of this rapid, tragic series of events. There's the defeat in battle, there's the slaying of the 2 sons, and there's the loss of the ark. And so what I want you to do now is to take your study sheet and to go and match the feelings of hopelessness that you find there. The ark is captured. Well, what does that refer to? And the Shiloh laid waste, what does that refer to? And Eli and sons are killed, and the Philistine. So you do that little matching there. That's kind of a fun thing to do. But then you come to the questions. Note that the loss of the ark is given great significance. Why is that the thing that is even of greater significance than the loss of the battle, for example? And then you go on to the chain of events. After the ark is captured and Philistia takes that box, the Ark of the Covenant of Israel, into their city, Ashdod first and other cities second, terrible things happen. And I want us to look at 2 of those events and what is the message that comes to us and must have come to the Philistines, if they read it aright, as to what is the meaning? Why did God do this, and what is He communicating through it? So take a break now and go to your study groups. All right, let's review the questions for a moment here. What about this matter of the ark's loss as being of paramount significance? See, Eli is waiting, wondering what's going to happen with this final crucial battle with Philistia. And he's sitting in his rocking chair, and the messenger comes, and he tells him 3 things. Number 1, the battle's been lost. Number 2, your sons are slain. And number 3, the Ark of the Covenant is captured by Philistia. And if you read that carefully, you'll notice that it is the loss of the Ark of the Covenant that the Hebrew writer gives the greatest amount of significance to. That is the greatest of the loss. And the reason being is that that symbolizes, as God has designated it to be, a symbol of His presence. Now, in our New Testament day, God is present with us by the power of the Holy Spirit. Pentecost had not happened. The Holy Spirit was not operative in as full a way in the Old Testament day as it is now in our time post-Pentecost. And so the symbol of God's presence with them was very, very significant for their own moral, spiritual well-being and life, for their followers of the God who is a God of the covenant. So, next question. What about the events that happened to the Philistines after they took the ark into the temple of their main god, Dagon? Well, when they looked the next morning, Dagon had fallen on his face. They set him up, and the next morning he fell on his face again, and he was dismembered, and his head and limbs were off as well. What did this say to them? Well, I think the evident and obvious implication is that God, the God of the Israelites, Jehovah God, is sovereign. He is the one who is most powerful. Now, you'll know that the plague broke out wherever the ark went. And so the people feared even having the ark in their city, and they wanted to get rid of it. And so their wise people and leaders got together and said, well, we've got to find out if this is just coincidence that the plague breaks out wherever we've got the Ark of the Covenant, or whether this is the work of the God of the Israelites that's symbolized in this box. Let's take 2 cows that have just given birth to calves. Now, if you've ever worked with livestock, and as a farm boy, I've been on the farm, and I know how zealously a mother cow will want to be close to her calf. So they said, let's take 2 cows that have just calved and have never pulled an ox cart, and let's put them on an ox cart, and if they go toward Israel and move on to the eastward into Israelite territory, then we'll know that this is God's doing. And if the cows just turn around and want to be by their calves, as the maternal instincts would dictate, then this God hasn't caused this plague. Well, you know the end of the story. I don't have to tell you. So that really tells you something about the fact that God is in this. He is a God who acts in life in decisive ways, and it tells them something about the God, Jehovah God, that the Hebrews have as their sovereign Lord. All right, so much for that. Now, let's move on to the study picture, and I want to combine the items 5 and 6 into one concept. And we look now at this figure who has a dream. He has an idea, and the idea has to do with a throne that now has a king in it. And his thought is, what we've got to do is to have an organization and a kingship put in place like the Philistines and some of the other major powers in that time, and that will erase our humiliation. We've been spiritually humiliated as well as we have been decimated militarily. And our answer is for us to have a king. So, let's go back to our study sheet now under item number 5 at the top of page 4 and take a look at where we are in the narrative. We have to take a look at this person who now has moved beyond the boyhood stage, obviously, and he is now an adult, and God has been giving him messages. His name is Samuel, and he is one of the greatest spiritual leaders since the time of Moses, the greatest spiritual leader since Moses. And so let's take a little look at what I have here in terms of a few bullet statements that get us up to speed in terms of where the narrative is. First of all, Samuel is the person who really bridges the gap between the era of the judges to the time of the kings. The crowning of Saul happens in the book of Samuel, and Samuel is the one who anoints him as the first king. So Samuel is the one who is sort of a judge, but he's also a prophet, and he's also a priest. He takes priestly duties, and he bridges this gap from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy. Now looking under item number 5A, under Samuel, Israel's faith was rekindled, and it renewed their national spirit. At long last, Samuel is the man of God who is given the kind of gifts, it is endowed with God's Spirit, and it is interesting. The Bible narrative tells us the people sensed and saw this, and they gravitated to Samuel as God's man in their midst. And so it stimulated them nationally, and they began now, even in this time of Samuel, before Saul, the king, came into play, or David later on, they began to have some early, smaller victories over Philistia. And peace was restored, at least in the highlands. So things were beginning to look better for Israel as far as the Philistine question is concerned. But now, as the decades roll by, Samuel, growing older, becomes less and less able to provide that kind of leadership. He was a circuit rider. He had several places that he would go periodically, and he would meet with the people. He was a spiritual leader, and he was kind of a judge settling disputes. He was a leader of the people. But as the decades rolled by, he was getting older. And it was apparent that Samuel's sons were not fit for leadership. So there is a sense of what do we do now? So, many in Israel realized that the clans were in no position as a loose confederacy to deliver a decisive blow that would throw off the yoke of Philistine in those areas where they had a monopoly. It was not an answer to the Philistine problem. And D, authority of an earthly king is a brand new thing for Israel. They have been a theocracy. God is their king. And God raises up leaders. And God gives leadership through these people. A Moses and a Joshua and now a Samuel. And so this matter of a king, an earthly king, is against the concept of a theocratic type of leadership in which God rules Israel, but through a human leader that he would raise up. Now, with that as the context, you've got three major questions to deal with as we close this study, and they're from the Bethel text, and I print them in your copy so you can have space to write out your answers. But these questions are: what has God's major concern? What is his major concern when Israel wants to appoint a king? Try to sort out that whole king question. Did God oppose the appointment of a king? That's the second one. And thirdly, is God against government, which would have leaders like kings or presidents? So you've got quite a bit to work with there. Take time in your study groups to note the references that are given here and come up with some answers. And so we'll take a break now and give you a chance to do that. All right, let's review these last three questions. First of all, number one, what was, that's a typo, what was God's major concern when Israel wanted to appoint a king? And I have chosen the first verse there in 1 Samuel 8. It is me, says the Lord, they are rejecting. Not you, Samuel. They don't want me to be their king any longer. That's a very important statement that the Lord gives to Samuel with regard to this issue of a king or not a king. And the issue is really not will they have a king, the issue is where is the source of their trust. And so God points his finger to the nub of the issue. They are not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me. And so the question is, where is the repository, ultimately, of our hope and our trust as far as the whole well-being of the country or of Israel as a nation or of our nation? Is it in our elected officials, or is God really the one who is back of that? And so, the second item that is of concern here is not only where is your ultimate trust, but the second thing, remember these kings are human beings. And human nature being what it is, you're going to have some real tough things that'll be demanded of you because you have a king. And obviously this is what transpired. And today, I think this is most dramatically seen if you travel to third world countries, at least some of them, where you see the opulence and the luxury of the regal palaces of the leaders, and you see the abject poverty and often squalor of so many of the citizenry. And also those kings seem to take a divine right kind of posture as though they're more than just a human being. They have some kind of divine characters. Sometimes there is the sense that they have absolute authority. They're not under the law, they're above the law. They're dictators. So those are the dangers that, and that God is concerned about. God said to Samuel, warn them that human nature being what it is, you can expect some of that to happen. Now, second, did God oppose the appointment of a king? Now, you may come down differently than I have on this, but my sense is that God did not oppose a king, but he opposed their reason and their motive for wanting a king. It could skirt the issue again, that the real issue is obedience to God, not getting a king. And furthermore, they wanted to be like other nations. That's not a good motivation. If your life as a nation is under God, then you want to be playing to that sense of what is right and best, as over against what other nations are doing. And I like the comment that is in the Old Testament Survey. It's a textbook that has been used at Fuller Seminary, written by Hubbard and Bush and one other Old Testament scholar. And their comment is that what God wants is theocracy through monarchy. That is to say, that governmental organization, well and good. God is not against that. It may well be a good machinery and way in which to govern. But it should always be seen as a servant of God. A theocracy stands above the monarchy. And so in the last item, you've got the New Testament take on government, and you'll notice that in Romans it says, obey the government, for God is the one who put it there. And Timothy says, Paul says, pray for the kings and all others who are in authority. And finally in 1 Peter, for the Lord's sake, accept all authority, the king as head of the state, and officials as he has appointed. So there you've got it. Now I'd like to close by lifting up Samuel as a great spiritual leader, the greatest since Moses, as we've said. And in 1 Samuel, there are at least 3 very wonderful, significant statements that are really rank high in the level of significance of statements that are made in the Old Testament. And I give you those references. And the first one has the following words. Far be it from me, and this is Samuel saying this to the people, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. I will teach you the way that is good and right. What a great, great statement for a leader to make. That's from the heart and the lips of Samuel. And then his words to Saul. Saul was a disobedient king, and we'll look at that next study. And he gives that very, very important statement that's repeated in several places of the Bible. To obey is better than to sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. I think that statement speaks for itself and doesn't need to be explained. And then finally, I'd like to lift up a statement in chapter 16, verse 17, where Samuel is given a statement from God. Man looks at the outward appearance. This had to do with the choosing of the king. But God looks at the heart. So, with those choice, wonderful guideline type of statements, we close our study that deals with the Philistine Menace.